But now let's talk with Martin Copenhaver. Martin, I wanted to applaud you as you walked across the room. That image of being applauded as a baby for doing something and then having to earn more and more praise. Most of us think of heaping praise on the people we love as a good thing. How is it that that gets in the way?
Well, I think we can get mixed up about that and think that we have to do something to be loved. I think if we're praising the accomplishments of our children, always associated with something they have achieved, and not heaping love on them, as you say, just for being who they are. I mean, I think that's one of the reasons why we need to tell our children every day that we love them, because they're not always heroes every day.
You know what it reminded me of, Martin, your message was, it spoke very directly to the act of baptism, especially, when we're in that pure moment of really being bestowed as beloved within the church community and by God, and it's such a special moment. Yeah. Why do we lose sense of that the older that we get? We're looking for praise, as you've talked about, and we lose the distinction between being beloved and the praise. What do you think contributes to that?
Well, I love the fact that baptism, you don't have to do anything to be baptized.
Right.
You don't know what kind of person this person is going to become, and yet you have that expression of God's love bestowed upon you. How do we lose that along the way? I mean, there are a lot of other voices that we're hearing.
Right.
And those are not necessarily God's voices. You have to clear a lot out to be able to hear God's voice.
I want to ask you a little bit more about this image of whose voice do you hear whispering in your ear. Mm-hmm. And of course there's some people who are just tortured by memories of family members who've been cruel or friends who have said unkind things, and they can't get those voices out of their ear.
Right.
Say more about that.
Yeah, I think that may be why Martin Luther, who led a kind of tortured life, had a very problematic relationship with his father. Why he said there's no comfort greater than baptism. Because in baptism, the God who cannot lie has bound God's own self to me. So he was silencing the voices in his own life by remembering the blessings of baptism.
Now the flip side of that, though, is the positive, as you said. I think of my grandmother as one of the most influential people in my life, and hearing her voice of encouragement based in a deep belief in her faith that she passed on to me. So there's an upside to that, but it's a tricky balance, isn't it?
I think it is.
Yeah.
I think it is.
What's the difference, to use a psychological term, between something like self-esteem and knowing that you are beloved by God?
Well, I think those are related, aren't they? I mean, I think self-esteem is what comes from that, receiving that and recognizing that you are beloved. I think that's maybe a good definition of what self-esteem is.
Now, Martin, you know we're blessed to have Lillian as a co-host, but she's also a wonderful writer in her own right. For the Christian Century, she's written her own book, and the two of you are working on a book, so I think this is a wonderful opportunity to talk about that a little bit. Why don't you share with us how this came about, how you decided to collaborate on this, and a little bit about what the book is about.
Yeah, wow, you get to be interviewed, I guess, is that right? So the book came out of our experience of writing for pastors and for the church, wanting to give a picture of what the pastoral life is like. And so these are vignettes, little kind of cross slices of what pastoral ministry is. And it might be a book that would be for someone who is considering the ministry, or someone who has forgotten why they got into the ministry in the first place, and for interested lay people who want a kind of deeper understanding of what pastoral ministry is about.
I think we were sort of looking for a book that didn't exist on our bookshelves, you know, that kind of book that you would give to someone on that occasion. And as we talked about it, we realized that between the two of us, we had already done a lot of writing and speaking on this topic of trying to really encourage people to consider the vocation of the ministry and to consider what's fun about it and joyful and exciting, but also to reflect on it with honesty and humor. And, you know, so sort of an appreciative honesty was the tone that we're looking for here. And it seemed interesting, too, that we had, between us, served in churches in all areas of the country, and big and small, urban, suburban. Martin is male, I'm female. Those are slightly different experiences of being in the ministry. It seemed like a fun way to do a book, and remarkably, we're still friends.
Yeah, that's right. Remarkably,
yes,
indeed.
he's agreed to be on the show.
How did the two of you collaborate to do this? Obviously, you live in Massachusetts. Lillian lives here. How does this work in terms of putting this together? And
well, gratefully, we were able to receive a grant to write the books. We were able to convene some people in various parts of the country to share their experiences, both seminarians, people new to ministry, people in theological education, and seasoned pastors as well. So we benefited from some of their reflections.
We also, I have to say, it's really fun to write a book with another person, a lot easier, I found it, because you encourage each other. So when I had written my first book, it's pretty lonely and hard to produce something in a vacuum. But Martin would write a really good chapter, and then I was inspired to write one, and we kind of kept pace with one another.
Yeah. So Daniel, I'm of the conviction that the allure of the ministry, and I think it has great allure, is really only understood from the inside. It's not the kind of job that you would pick out at a jobs fair or a classified ad. When you talk about what the benefits are, it would be very hard to describe that unless you inhabit that life. And it is more of a life than just a job. It is a vocation, a calling, and that's why the title. And so we're trying to give a little bit of a glimpse so that people might understand the allure of this work.
You wrestling with some of the challenges of that as well?
Absolutely.
Why don't you speak to a couple of those just for our audience? I'm sure there are many that both of you could speak to.
Yeah. Wanted to be appreciative but honest about those things. And so, I mean, what are some of the challenges?
Raising money, especially these days, and but dealing with issues of money and sort of personally where most ministers are at financially is often a pretty precarious place, and yet we're, out there talking about that.
And the church is the place where we have an opportunity to live with and hopefully love those we did not choose. I mean, there are challenges in that.
Absolutely. Well, that kind of brings us back in an interesting way to this idea of being beloved.
Yeah.
What can we do more in our active spiritual lives and our daily lives to plug into that more? I know my faith community has a retreat called the Beloved Retreat for couples, where they go together and try to spend a weekend to immerse themselves and really experience this feeling that you're talking about. Yeah. Not of praise, not of appreciation necessarily, but this sense that God is a much larger power of love in our lives.
Yeah. To get that reminder, I was in Israel this spring for the first time, and there I learned about this beautiful Muslim practice that when a baby is born, that the first thing when the baby is born, whispered in that child's ear, is the Adhan, which is the call to prayer. Allah is great, God is great, in the right ear. And then in the left ear, the call to worship, which again begins, Allah is great, God is great. So that God is the first word that the baby hears. And then in the call to prayer, 5 times a day, as it fills the streets of Muslim areas, you hear that again, what was once whispered in your ear, because we all need a reminder, maybe at least 5 times a day.
Mm-hmm.
To me, it's a wonderful reminder, this message, that the words that we whisper in one another's ears really matter, that these are messages that you carry forever, and it might make us think a little bit more about what we say to one another.
Absolutely.
How we treat each other.
Mm-hmm.
And if God's words to Jesus, the first words are so tender,
right.
What about...
Words matter. And somebody said, whoever said sticks and stones can break my bones, but words cannot hurt me, lived among deaf mutes, right? Absolutely, words matter. Mm-hmm.